Hey, good morning, everybody. It's day 6 here at the Center for Real Estate Education. My name is Tim Jensen, your instructor, and I'll be with you all day and all through the week. Yeah, if today is your first day, welcome. Welcome to our classroom. We run a rolling mixed match schedule. Whenever you start, perfectly okay. You don't have to start on day 1 or whatever. You have a year to complete your assignments. So please don't worry about missing a day. You can always fill in later, go to our schedule, go to our tracker. You can find all the information you want at recareercenter.com. Okay, a couple of quick announcements before we start. Number one, there is no recording, audio or visual, of any of these pre-licensing classrooms. It is a requirement by the New Jersey Real Estate Commission that you cannot record these sessions. Number two, no posting of any links in our chat discussion group. We've had problems and very severe problems in the past with that, so we have to limit anybody's ability to post links unless you clear it with us first beforehand. So please don't post any links in our chat room. Nothing good can happen from it. If you do, you'll be reminded to remove it. If you don't, you will be dismissed from class. So, no foul language in our discussion, please. I know we're all adults and can handle such language, but it always makes a nicer conversation if we remove that from our language. If you're having connection problems, number one, close off all other programs and applications running in the background. They tend to soak up bandwidth, which this program needs. If you're having further problems, you can always hit your refresh button. It's a little semicircle with an arrow up by your address bar. You'll have to log back in, but it will reset your connection. And if you only miss a couple minutes, no problem. But if you're later than a half an hour coming to class, or you're offline for more than half an hour, except for breaks and lunchtime, then you will be penalized for the time. Also, if you have any administrative questions, how do I do this? Where do I get that? What's the schedule? Where do I do this? How to record my hours? All that stuff. You can always go to recareercenter.com and look up that information. Or you can wait till noontime when Noel or Lauren come online and they will discuss those topics with you. Please stay at noon to ask the questions. Don't go away and then come back 20 minutes later expecting them to still be there. They may not, and they may have already answered whatever questions you have at least 2 or 3 times. If you have any other questions regarding what we're covering or topics about real estate or things like that that's not covered in the classroom, or it's not an admin question, I always stick online at the end of the day to handle those questions. So feel free to stick online with me and ask some questions if you have them. We have several different breaks during the day. We have a coffee break at 10:30 for a half hour. We have a lunch break at 12 for 1 hour. And we have another coffee break at 2:30 for half an hour, and we'll be done by 4:30 at the end of the day. And as always, I caution everyone, the best way to learn and absorb this material is to read these chapters before you come to class. If you do, then you have a very basic understanding of the topics being discussed, which leads to better comprehension and retention of that information. But if you do not pre-read these chapters before you come, you're going to find yourself behind the 8 ball asking questions for clarity, and the class is ready to move on, and you see it can be a problem. So please pre-read your chapters before coming. So if there's any follow-up questions to our discussion right now, please ask. If not, I'm going to start by reviewing chapters 10 and 11, and then we're going to move on to chapters 12 and 13 today. So does anybody have any basic questions before I'm ready to start? Okay, not seeing any questions. I'm going to moderate the conversation. I will open it up for Q&A later. So let's get busy. For your homework, chapters 10 and 11. Let's go over that right now. For chapter 10, the answers to your homework quizzes were: number 1, B as in boy. 2, B as in boy. 3, B as in boy. 4A, 5C, 6A, 7C, 8, D as in dog, 9, D as in dog, and 10, C. Again, chapter 10 homework answers are: number 1, B boy, 2, B boy, 3, B boy, 4A, 5C, 6A, 7C, 8, D dog, 9, D dog, and 10, C. For chapter 11, the homework answers were: number 1, C, 2, D for dog, 3, D for dog, 4, C, 5A, 6, B as in boy, 7, D for dog, 8, D for dog, 9, C, and 10, C. Again, chapter 11 homework questions are as follows. Number 1, the answers are C, 2, D dog, 3, D dog, 4, C, 5A, 6, B for boy, 7, D dog, 8, D dog, 9, C, and 10, C. I'll open it up. Did anybody have any questions regarding the homework from last night? Not seeing any questions, then I am going to moderate the conversation. And we're going to start a discussion on chapter 12, leases, landlords, and tenants. This is a very big and very important chapter to understand, guys. So please, if you haven't pre-read it, yeah, you should have. Okay. So at the end of our presentation today, we're done with chapter 12, you should be able to explain characteristics of 4 leasehold estates, as well as describe standard lease provisions, including various forms of eviction, effects of truth in renting, and the Americans with Disabilities Act. We'll also be able to discuss differences between various types of leases and identify functions of what a property manager does. So without ado, let's get busy. What is a lease? Good question. Thanks for asking. By the way, a lease is a demise. What? A demise. That's what a term that refers to a conveyance of rights. In other words, the lease conveys from the landlord to the tenant certain rights to the property. Last Wednesday, if you were with us, we talked about freehold estates in real property, ownership of real property, and ownership rights. Today, we're talking about leasehold estates, or another term would be less than freehold. And a leasehold estate interest is where someone, via a lease, gains certain rights to property. The rights would include things of the right of possession, to live there, to use it for whatever legal purpose you have. The right to use the property, again, for any legal purpose. So possession and use, quiet enjoyment. No one should be bothering you. The landlord cannot just walk in at any time he wants to because you have privacy rights. So some of the rights that the landlord has in the property are transferred to the tenant for a temporary period of time. Could be for a year, could be for month to month, it could be whenever you decide to move out type of interest, of which there are going to be 4 of them we're going to discuss in a few minutes. So a lease is a transfer of rights to possess and use the property for any legal manner. The rights are transferred from the owner to the tenant via a lease for a specific period of time. And the term demise, as I had said, is the word that is defining the conveyance or transfer of property and the rights of that property via the lease itself. So therefore, the lease is both a contract, as we discussed on Friday, as a contract, and a conveyance. Were there any basic questions of these introductory topics before we move on? And again, I'm not seeing any questions, so I'm assuming we're all good. So let's move on. All right. Now, there are 4 types of leasehold estates in real property. The first one is known as an estate for years. An estate for years is defined by having a definite termination date to the lease. So if I rent an apartment from you from January 1st to October 31st, that's an estate for years, but it's not quite a year, it doesn't matter. So long as that is a definitive termination date, by definition, then it meets the criteria of an estate for years, meaning it has a beginning and a definitive termination date. And because it has a definitive termination date, there's no requirement for the landlord to notice the tenant or the tenant to notice the landlord of them terminating the lease at the end of the period of time and moving out. In other words, the landlord doesn't have to say, hey, just a reminder 3 months from now, just letting you know you got to move out. The tenant knows that, or at least should know that. So at the end of that 3-month period, the tenant just moves out at the termination date. There should be no question as to what the tenant's doing. If the tenant does not move out, then there's a problem. So my suggestion, I just did a weekend property management course. I don't know if anybody who's in class was with me. But one of the things I made mention was, even though this is a definitive termination date, the owner or property manager should do a proactive inquiry and ask at least 3 months before the termination date, hey, Mr. Tenant, I'm not giving you notice, just asking, are you still planning on moving out on the termination date in your lease? And if they say, oh, you know what, I meant to talk to you about that, I mean to stay another year. Great, I'm glad you said so. Let me draw up a new lease, which could take effect the day after the termination date, so you can stay in the apartment without a problem. Or, no, I really am going to be terminating on that date. So now I can go out and search for another tenant, start interviewing, screening, and background, so that by the time this tenant moves out, I'll have another one ready to move in. But an estate for years leasehold estate interest means there's a definitive termination date and no notice to quit is required on landlord or tenant's part. A periodic estate is the second type of leasehold estate. But before I move on, it looks like there's a question or two, so let me open it up. What questions do you have about estates for years? Alma. Alma, did you have a question about estate for years? Apparently not, so let's move on. All right. Periodic estate. This one does not have a permanent or definitive termination date, rather. What it has is a repeating period of time interest. You may have heard people say, I'm on a month-to-month lease. What does that mean? It means their interest in the property is month to month, and it's renewable every 30 days, or may be canceled by giving a 30-day notice or 1 month's notice. Since it's month to month, landlord or tenant have to give 1 month's notice to terminate. So if you're a month-to-month tenant in my building, I could say, hey, thanks for the check for the beginning of the month, and by the way, you have your 30-day notice to quit, because I'm going to be renting it out to another tenant in 30 days, so you have to find another place to live very quickly, so get your stuff together and get ready to move out. Or the tenant could say, hey, Mr. Landlord, I found a new apartment or whatever, buying a house. I'm giving you 30 days notice to quit. Perfectly legit. You make your monthly payment, and then 30 days later, you move out. It's that simple. That's if it's month to month. It might be week to week. That's a periodic estate interest as well, because it's a repeating period of time. That means only 1 week's notice has to be given if it's week to week. It may be year to year. However, New Jersey law says that on a periodic interest of more than 30 days, then the maximum allowable notice is 90 days. In other words, if you're a year-to-year lease and you decide not to renew the following year, you have to give a minimum 90-day notice for a periodic interest based on longer than a month. Did anyone have any questions pertaining to a periodic estate interest? Gary and Shari, you guys have some questions? Or not? Can't tell if your dialogue bar is open. I see guys typing questions. And then does a month-to-month have to be in writing? We're going to get to that in a few minutes. See a couple other folks typing, so I'll wait. How can it be year to year and not be an estate for years? Again, it could be no termination date. Your lease doesn't terminate after a year. It's just automatic renewable if you want. That's all. So all annual periodic estates in New Jersey require 90-day notice. No. Well, hang on a sec. Rachel, so all annual periodic estates in New Jersey require 90 days notice or more. 90-day notice, period. That's what you have to give, 90 days. You said week to week, right? So do you pay week to week? Just to be clear, you could, or you could pay full in advance, whatever you want to do. So all annual periodic estates, yes, we answered that. Okay, fine, thank you. Was there any other questions before we move on? I see Shari, you have a question. Or Shari, my mistake. The print is so small on my computer. I have to my eyes aren't exactly great either. So a month to month isn't a 30-day notice to begin? No, it is. I said on a month to month, you have to give 1 month's notice. On a week to week, you have to give 1 week's notice. But for a period of longer than month to month, you can have quarter to quarter, year to year. Then you require a 90-day notice. Hope I cleared that up. Was there another question, Sherry? No? Gotcha. Okay, good. Let's move on then. So we talked about an estate for years, definitive termination date. A periodic estate, a period of time that automatically repeats until one party gives notice. And then there's another type called tenancy at will. Tenancy at will is for an undetermined period of time. I'd like to rent the apartment, but I don't know when and how long I'm going to need it for. Well, in that case, we'll create a tenancy at will notice, which requires 90-day notice to quit. So if you enter into a 90-day notice and find out that you got to make a move soon, you must give 90-day notice before you can terminate the lease. Landlord must give 90-day notice for the tenant to terminate on a tenancy at will. In other words, it's an indefinite period of time. There's no automatic repeating period of time. There's no definitive termination date. It's just whenever you want to. You can live here until you give 90-day notice to quit. And it says that this tenancy at will is terminated by death of either the landlord or the tenant. Ooh. So if you're a tenant at will, without any other type of agreement, and your landlord dies, guess what? You got to vacate. With no notice? With no notice. Now, that doesn't happen often. But if it were to happen, hopefully whoever's the heir to the estate will give you some time to move out. But technically, when the landlord or tenant dies, then without notice, you may be terminating your lease. Was there any questions about a tenancy at will? Tenancy at will, 90-day notice for both tenant and landlord. Correct. They must both adhere to 90-day notice. Correct. And I'm not seeing any other questions. Okay, so then let's move on. And then the last type, the fourth leasehold estate, is known as a tenancy at sufferance. And a tenancy at sufferance, as opposed to a fee simple interest. Remember last Wednesday we talked about the highest recognized interest in real property is called the fee simple estate. A tenancy at sufferance estate is the lowest recognized legal interest in real property, where the tenant probably came into the lease legally, had a written lease or an agreement with the owner and paid rent, but then something happened and the tenant defaulted in the lease, whether they didn't pay, won't adhere to rules and regulations. Typically, a tenancy at sufferance is where the tenant does not continue under the requirements of the lease, but still stays and occupies the apartment. The reason you're a tenancy at sufferance is most likely you stop paying the rent. In other words, in New Jersey, a person renting property after living in the property for 30 days has established the right of possession and occupancy. If they stop paying after 30 days, then the landlord can't just kick them out. They have to go to court and evict them. We're going to cover topics of eviction later today, so don't jump on that yet. So a tenant at sufferance is there without permission of the landlord, not abiding by any agreement, won't pay or whatever the case may be, and will be evicted through a court order eventually, or will leave at their own leisure. Did anybody have any specific questions about tenancy at will or tenancy at sufferance? Excuse me. So this is basically the same as squatting rights. There are no squatter rights in New Jersey, no. In other words, this tenant can't just like illegally move into a part and occupy it. They have to enter in through a legal door. In other words, the lease itself should be created to allow the occupancy. So there are no such things as squatter rights in New Jersey, just to clear that up. So no other questions? I'm going to assume, and I hate to assume, you know what happens when you assume, just asking. Everybody's clear on this? No. So what's your problem, Modena? What's your question you have? Is it illegal to just change the locks? No, you can't do that. I do. How long until eviction again? Depends on the interest. If it is stayed for years or periodic tenancy or a leasehold estate through a tenancy at will, varies. Oh, I meant no other question. Okay, sorry, misunderstood. Anyone else with a question before we're ready to move on? Not seeing any questions. I will move on. Whoops, sorry about that. Hang on. There we go. All right. So, estate for years having a definitive termination date, no notice requirement. Periodic estate, a repeating period of time, and depending on the period of time, if it's month to month, a month's notice. Week to week, a week's notice. Longer than a month, 90-day notice. If it's a tenancy at will with no definitive termination date, no periodic interest, just whenever you decide, requires a 90-day notice to terminate. And a tenancy at sufferance pretty much has already given notice of termination by the landlord and won't move out. Therefore, they're holding tenancy illegally after that has been declared. Therefore, the landlord does not give consent to live there. They live there anyway. The only remedy, besides the tenant moving out on their own, is to go to court and handle the eviction. You cannot, landlords cannot do self-evictions. It's illegal and you can go to jail. And we'll talk about that later. All right, moving on. Standard lease provisions. Now, first of all, you understand, and if you were with me Friday, since a lease is both a contract and a conveyance, then we must adhere to the rules of contract. And because you're going to be getting real estate license, the statute of frauds rule and the real estate commission requirement is that realtors, licensees doing business, must get all agreements in writing. All agreements. Now, I know there are estates and interests that don't require written leases for periods of time. However, if you are a licensee, and that's what you're here to do, is get a real estate license. If you're here to get a real estate license and get one, then any lease that you are involved in must be in writing by what's known as the statute of frauds. Then, the other essentials for valid contracts of conveyance are a capacity to contract. We talked about this in our contract class Friday. Capacity means ability to perform. Mr. Tenant, can you supply a social security card, give me authorization numbers or authorization signature to check your credit score, because I want to see what your credit capacity is. I want to know who your employer is, how much money you make, balance of copies of bank statements for the past year or so. I want to know how much you make, so give me a copy of your paycheck. I want to call your employer. I want to call your previous landlords. In other words, I'm going to do a background checks to see if you have the capacity to rent and under my landlord tenant relationship. Are you 18 years of older, or have you been emancipated by law, which makes you legally an adult? So I have to ask the questions and find out, do you have the capacity to contract? And not just from one person, but from any adult who is not a dependent child of the parent tenant. So if I have 3 adult females renting an apartment, I want all 3 to prove they have the ability to rent, because they're all going to be named as responsible parties in the lease, which means every one of them has the obligation to make sure that that lease is paid in full. Kelly, you have a question, so let me open it up for you. What's your question? Sounds like you can press a little more into background with rentals than purchase. I'm not understanding what your question is inferring, or your statement's inferring. Can you explain that? What do you mean press a little further? Difference between contract and conveyance. A contract is a legally agree. It's an agreement, a voluntary agreement between 2 competent parties to do or not do something in exchange for consideration and for a legal purpose. A conveyance is a transfer of something to another. That's the difference between contract and conveyance. So as in the renter's rights, I'm still not understanding, Kelly, what you mean by can press a little more into background regarding renters' rights. You mean by calling their employer to make sure they have a job, or calling their last landlord to see if they ever got evicted or something like that? No, that's not more. It's actually on the same par as a credit or mortgage company would do by looking into the background of an applicant for a mortgage. So no, it's not more invasive or more whatever the term you want to use. If a lease must be at least 3 years. Mindy, I don't know if I ever said that. I don't think I did, so I don't know what you're referring to. Matthew, if a rental property was purchased and no written lease existed or cannot be produced, does the sale trigger a right for the new owner to implement a new written lease upon sale? Well, Matthew, if you have no written lease, then it is automatically assumed you are a tenant at will. Therefore, 90-day notice is required to quit. You don't have to draw up new leases. You just give notice to quit, and that's all there is. There's no background by seller on a home sale. Correct. I think they're referring to screening a tenant. I believe that's what I was referring to. I don't think we were talking about the seller. We were talking about the, I'm sorry, if I did say seller, I meant buyer. Oh, I see at least, oh, I see lease can be under 3 years if not in writing. Correct. By the way, like I said, as a real estate practitioner, all leases that you're involved in must be in writing no matter how long they're for. Students who are adults, can't they co-sign for a lease, then asking their parents to co-sign for them? Can't they co-sign? I'm sorry, let me understand your question, Kieran. Can't they co-sign for a lease, then asking their parents to You mean can't they lease a property with their parents co-sign? Well, yeah, that just makes their parents liable for the tenant, for the minor's responsibilities. And then the parent would be named as a capacity to contract as well. Then why does it say must be in writing? Okay, hang on, guys. Let me moderate the conversation. So this is what happens if we come in late. We miss maybe a point or two, or if you drift away, go get a cup of coffee and come back, you may miss a point or two. So understand, guys, I did say this. Not all leases have to be in writing. There are time frames. And as you say, if it's less than 3 years, it doesn't require it to be in writing. However, as a licensee, your license law demands that all agreements must be in writing. All agreements. I mean, if you rented a property for 1 hour or 1 day or 1 month or 1 year, doesn't matter. It has to be in writing if a realtor is involved in it. So just because a landlord can rent property with an unwritten lease if no realtor's involved, that's true. However, if a realtor is involved, then it must be in writing no matter how long it's for. I hope I cleared that up. Did anybody have any other questions before I move on? You skipped my question 2 times. So I'm sorry. What type of lease or sign one-time contract? I'm sorry. What type of lease of sign? Let me try to understand what you're asking me. What type of lease of sign one-time contract and automatic upgrade every year without sign new contract? Can you put that in a better statement so I can understand what you're asking? I'm having trouble understanding what you're asking. Then why does it say it must be? Okay, again, we cover that. Period to period. Okay, whatever. Anybody else with a question before I'm ready to move on? Jinyu, did you have a retyping of that question so maybe I can get a better understanding of what you're trying to ask me? I think he's talking about periodic estates. Yeah, I didn't infer that from his question. I didn't really understand his question. You could be talking, I guess you may be talking about a tenancy at will or a periodic estate. I'm not sure. Just keep paying the rent. What kind of lease is that? Again, I don't understand. Under every lease, you have to keep paying the rent until your lease is over. I think they're asking which contract lease renews every year without signing a new one. That would be a periodic estate, Chelsea, correct. But I'm not getting that from his question. So I just want to confirm, but I don't want to drift too far off course because we still have a lot of information to present today if we want to get out at 4:30. Was there anyone else with a question before we move on? Michael, you have a question. Michael Blum. Hey, Tim, I'm in an apartment on a 1-year lease, and then after that, it's automatically converts to month to month. That's called a periodic estate, correct? Was there anyone else? I see a couple more people typing. I don't want to diss you guys. I want to make sure I cover the questions. So an estate for years automatically, no. No, it terminates on the termination date. It does not automatically renew. I think you may be missing, either maybe you didn't read the chapter, or I'm not sure where you're coming from, Renee, because it's very clear that an estate for years has a definite termination date. I'm new. That's understandable. But please, read the information. It's very clearly written in your book. Again, I don't want to sound, nasty or anything, but guys, you have an obligation to read this stuff. If you don't read it, then I'm not responsible for your lack of understanding. You are. So just understand that. Can a tenant cancel a lease anytime? Under the terms and conditions of what kind of estate they have, only under those conditions could they do it. So please, Alvin, read the conditions of each tenancy to understand what the notice period is required. I'm not going to go back and rehash all 4 things again. Moving on. So we said they must have capacity to contract. Leases must also have what's known as a demising clause. Remember, a demise is a transfer of rights. So a demising clause would say something like, we rent, we lease, we let the apartment to you. In other words, there must be words of conveyance and contract, and those words cover that. The landlord gives, the tenant takes under an agreement of leasing, rent, or letting. There must be an adequate description of the premises in a standard lease provision. What exactly are you renting? If it's a commercial space, you want to accompany that with a floor plan of the unit and square footage that they're renting. If it's land, then a survey showing the boundaries of the property. If it's a residential tenancy, then street address, lot and block number, building and apartment number would all be contributors to a legal description of the premises. Then there must be a clear statement of the term. How long is the lease for? This is where you will know whether you have an estate for years, a periodic estate, or a tenancy at will. It will state that under the statement of the terms. Then, also in a lease, it must be very clear about what the conditions of rent are. How much do you owe? When is it due? What kind of grace period does the landlord give you? What is the late fees involved? And what happens if you don't pay? Also, the lease must be in writing for a term of more than 3 years, as we discussed. However, if you are a licensee, a real estate licensee doing the lease and are involved in it, then and if you're the property owner renting out property to non-licensees, then you must, in every scenario, get it in writing. And as I said, as a licensee, I don't care if it's for a day, an hour, a week, a month, a year, a decade. It's got to be in writing. And for a lease to be valid, the competent parties who have capacity to contract must sign the agreement, making them each individual as a responsible party in the lease. Did that cause anyone to create any more questions about what we're talking about? So in other words, does anybody have any questions about what we're saying here about a lease, standard provisions? Okay, there's a question, so I'll wait. So if you are investing in Airbnb, you would use a tenancy at will contract. We haven't even talked about Airbnb, and that's a short-term scenario. But if you are a realtor involved in Airbnb, then it's required that it be in writing, and most likely not a tenancy at will. But again, each town may have their own specific rules and regulations regarding Airbnbs. In fact, in Jersey City, they've outlawed all Airbnbs and Verbos. You can't do them in Jersey City. It's against the law. So it's up to your municipality to tell you if they're allowable and under what conditions they might be. Will a description in words be enough, or does it have to be a picture? It doesn't have to be a picture. You don't have to have a survey or anything like that. However, in a commercial lease, you do want to have a copy of the floor plan as a PDF or picture attachment. If it's a piece of land, you do want to have a survey showing the borders of the boundaries of the property. But in a residential lease, just a descriptor of the property is fine. Okay, I think I answered the questions. So let me move on then. All right. Now, other typical lease provisions include the right to use the premises. Mr. Tenant, you have the right to use the residence or the commercial space for any legal purpose. You do not have the right to use the premises or the commercial space for an illegal purpose. There is police law out there that says you can and can't do certain things. So if you're renting an apartment from me, you cannot use it as a grow house for your marijuana crops. That's against the law. And you can wind up in jail for doing that. What about the landlord? Is he liable? Yeah. That's why the landlord must insist that if they catch a tenant doing that, that they either immediately cease and desist or are subject to eviction. And if the tenant still disobeys, then report it to the cops. Let them arrest the guy. I'd rather not see that happen, because then I have an apartment that's not being paid for by a person sitting in a pokey, and then they may be roping it off for evidence pending a trial or something if a crime was committed. So understand, guys, you don't want to allow illegal activities in your rental units, whether it's commercial or residential. If it's not allowed, it's not allowed and should never be allowed. Apparently, I struck a nerve. I saw several people questioning, so let me open it up. What questions do you have? If a landlord doesn't know something illegal is going on, I'm assuming they aren't liable as well. Michael, ignorance is no excuse for the law. Ignorance is no excuse for what happens in an apartment. Landlord must know what's going on in the building at all times. Must. In other words, the landlord's got to do some visual inspections and talk to your tenants. Walk around the building, smell, sniff, look, see, hear, touch, to find out what's going on at all times. So don't assume anybody's liable or not. Understand, guys, if I find out something's going on in the building that's illegal, I immediately address the problem and rid it ASAP, or I may have to report them to police to avoid liability. Because if I allow something to continue in an illegal manner, then I could be just as guilty as the tenant. So again, understand, guys, Michael, I don't want to sound harsh, but a property manager's or a landlord's job is not to just sit back and collect rent. It's to make sure that everybody's doing the right thing. You got to inspect your property every so often to assure that. Apparently, I opened up a can of worms, so go ahead. What's your questions? Was there any other questions? Everybody disappeared all of a sudden. And here we go again. Here we go with the what ifs. Stop with the what ifs. What if the landlord is doing something illegal? Does the tenant have any rights to say do anything? Of course. That's just common sense. All right. Was there any other questions pertaining to what has been presented so far? No scenarios, what ifs, and variable questions, just on the information being presented. And I'm not seeing any, but Kieran, you have a question. I guess, Jin, you have a question, so we'll wait. Do you guys have questions, or did you just leave your dialogue bars open? Contract always say no pets. Well, that's not true. There are buildings who allow pets, but then you have pets. What can the landlord do? Evict the tenant. Non-compliance, default of the terms and conditions of the lease, eviction. If state all the do's and don'ts and it's signed and while are liable as landlord. Again, Kieran, I don't understand what you're asking. Maybe you can clean that question up and re-ask it. What is the CIS in these? Guys, we haven't gotten there yet. Hang on. Again, you guys are jumping ahead, want to know stuff, and it's not even been presented yet. So hang on. We're just talking about the use of the premises. We haven't even got past that yet. I will get to it, I promise. It is allowable to smoke in an apartment? I don't know. I don't believe so. I believe there's a no smoking policy in all residential properties unless it's privately held. Certainly in commercial tenancies, no smoking is allowed inside unless you have a special permit from the local municipality. So guys, please, let's stick to the topics we're discussing. Let's not go off on the tangents. It just distracts from our information that you need to remember, and it kind of like just prolongs the day. I called my landlord recently regarding neighbor smoking, and it was allowed. So maybe in his privately owned building, he allows it. Okay. Anybody else with a question before we move on? I said, if all the rules are signed, while is the landlord's liable? I'm sorry, I said, if all the rules are signed, while is the landlord, again, got me on that. I'm sorry, guys, but I do need to move on. I'm sorry, but I just don't want to diss you. It's just that we have so much ground to cover, and you guys are going off on tangents that are not going to be asked on the real estate test. Remember, you're going to be tested on the information being presented in the topics discussed and in the book, not on the what ifs and under what case and under this. Don't do that. You're just going to screw yourself up and everybody else. So don't go there. Just keep yourself directed at the information being presented in the time frame that's being presented. So again, we got to move on. So again, use of premises for any legal purpose. The term of the lease must be specified. How long is it? When does it start? When does it end? Does it have an ending date? Is it renewable? Is it not renewable? Has to be very clear. Also, New Jersey has specific requirements in a lease. Number one is that any business relationship the real estate firm has with a landlord or tenant must be disclosed in the lease so all parties know about it. Secondly, the tenant must acknowledge that the CIS, Consumer Information Statement, has been provided.